The Six Wives of Henry VIII. Many English kings and queens are known around the globe, but perhaps the most famous of them all was the Tudor King Henry VIII. As larger-than-life personalities go, it was hard to top him. The multi-talented, athletic, tyrannical, lustful monarch left an indelible stamp on history with his founding of the Church of England, while his epic love life, marrying 6 women, divorcing 2, outliving 1, beheading 2, has fascinated people for centuries. Many people have played Henry VIII in television and film adaptations. There was Jonathan Rhys-Meyers in The Tudors, Damien Lewis in Wolf Hall, Richard Burton in Anne of the Thousand Days, Keith Mitchell in The Six Wives of Henry VIII and Henry VIII and His Six Wives, 2 separate films, Robert Shaw in A Man for All Seasons, Charles Laughton, The Private Life of Henry VIII, Eric Bana, The Other Boleyn Girl. Brian Blessed even had a go in the comedic Henry 8.0, which if you haven't seen, you ought to. It's very entertaining. We've even had, for instance, Ben Wilbond, who's played him in Horrible Histories, the very clever BAFTA-winning television show. There's Jared Harris, who played her in The Other Boleyn Girl. Rowan Atkinson had a stint also in Horrible Histories. Ray Winston, or I'm fucking Henry VIII, back in 2003. Even you had Sid James in Carry On Henry. Such is the size of Henry, not least in terms of he turned into a rather obese individual. But the fact is that there have been 30 fictional Henrys covering over a century of motion pictures, from silent film era to streaming TV. And that is the fascination that he has held for people. Now, of course, there is much debate about what he might be classified as. There are many that could see that he would be viewed as a narcissist. There are others that might suggest that he was a psychopath or a narcissistic psychopath, although there are those who argue against it, that such depictions are through the lens of modern eyes, and that much of his behaviour was actually standard for the time. For example, the fact that he believed that he had a personal line in effect to God, well, might be seen by as delusional in a modern view, but back during the 16th century, that wasn't unusual in itself for someone to make such a claim. But I'm not here to examine Henry VIII, but of course, it would be remiss of me to not give him some form of mention in relation to the topic that I will be talking about. Known as much as for his tyrannical behaviours and the founding of the Church of England is the fact that he had 6 wives. In common parlance, the wives of Henry VIII were the 6 queens consort of King Henry VIII of England between 1509 and his death in 1547. Interestingly, in legal terms, Henry only had 3 wives because 3 of his marriages were annulled by the Church of England. However, he was never granted an annulment by the Pope, as he desired, for Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. Annulments declare that a true marriage never actually took place, unlike a divorce, in which a married couple end their union. Along with his 6 wives, Henry took several mistresses, and some of you may know, for instance, that from Bessie Blunt, he had Henry Fitzroy, Fitz and Roy meaning son of the king, and that he recognised the bastard child, giving him titles and an income, etc. But we're not dealing with his issue, we're dealing with the point in relation to his wives. Now, interestingly, David Starkey, the historian, talked about Henry VIII's behaviour as a husband, where he explained it was extraordinary that in the beginning of Henry's marriages, he was usually a very good husband. He was very tender to them. Research shows that he addressed some of his wives as sweetheart. He was a good lover. He was very generous. The wives were given huge settlements of land and jewels. He was immensely considerate when they were pregnant. However, if his current wife did not please him or did anything to fire his short temper, there would be consequences. Of course, 2 of Henry's wives were beheaded by his command. There were 6 wives, First, there was Catherine of Aragon. She was originally married to Arthur, Henry's older brother. She was a year older than Arthur and 6 years older than Henry. After Arthur died of sweating sickness in 1502, a papal dispensation by Henry VII was obtained to enable her to marry Henry, though the marriage didn't occur until he came to the throne in 1509, when Henry was 17 years old and Catherine was 23. Catherine became pregnant soon after, but the girl was stillborn. She became pregnant again in 1510 and gave birth to Henry, Duke of Cornwall, in 1511, but he died almost 2 months later. She gave birth to a stillborn boy in 1513 and to another boy who died within hours in 1515. Finally, at age 30, she bore a healthy daughter, Mary, in 1516. After giving birth to Mary, Catherine is quoted to say, "We are both young. It was a daughter this time. By the grace of God, the sons will follow." Unfortunately, she never did have that son Henry so desperately wanted. It was 2 years before she conceived again. The pregnancy ended with a short-lived girl. It's said that Henry truly loved Catherine of Aragon, as he professed it many times. However, Henry became concerned he did not have a son to continue the Tudor dynasty. Henry took several mistresses throughout this marriage, including Elizabeth Blunt, with whom he fathered an illegitimate son, as I mentioned earlier, Henry Fitzroy. He also had an affair with Mary Boleyn, the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, English ambassador to France. Later, Henry turned his attention to Mary's younger sister, Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting to Catherine. Unlike her sister, Anne refused to become his mistress. Henry wrote many love letters to Anne and quickly became infatuated with her. By the late 1520s, it was clear Catherine, now in her mid-40s, would not bear any more children, and Henry, increasingly desperate for a legitimate son, planned to marry Anne. Henry, at the time a Roman Catholic, sought the Pope's approval for an annulment on the grounds that Catherine had first been his brother's wife. He used a passage from the Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an impurity. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness, they shall be childless." Despite the Pope's refusal to annul the marriage, Henry separated from Catherine in 1531. Catherine was 45. Henry was 40. He ordered Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, to convene a court. On the 23rd of May, 1533, Cranmer ruled the marriage to Catherine null and void. On 28th of May, 1533, he pronounced the king legally married to Anne, with whom Henry had already secretly exchanged wedding vows. This led to England breaking from the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of a Church of England separate from the Catholic Church. Shortly after marrying Anne Boleyn, Henry sent Catherine away. She did not see Henry or their daughter Mary again, before her death in isolation at age 50. Anne Boleyn was Henry's second wife and the mother of Elizabeth I. Henry's marriage to Anne and a later execution made her a key figure in the political and religious upheaval at the start of the English Reformation. She was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard, daughter of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk. She was dark-haired, with beautiful features and lively manners. She was educated in Europe by Margaret of Austria. She then moved to France and lived there for some years, largely as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude. Anne resisted the king's attempts of letters to seduce her and refused to become his mistress, as her sister Mary Boleyn had been. It soon became the one absorbing object of the king's desires to secure an annulment from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, so that he could marry Anne. He wrote a love letter that provides evidence of some level of intimacy between them, in which he admires her pretty duckies breasts. It eventually became clear that Pope Clement VII was unlikely to give the king an annulment, so Henry began to break the power of the Catholic Church in England for the current obsession he had with Anne Boleyn. Henry dismissed Cardinal Wolsey from public office and later had the Boleyn's family chaplain Thomas Cranmer appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1532, Henry and Anne went through a secret wedding service. Henry was 41 and Anne was in her late 20s. She soon became pregnant, and there was a second public wedding service in London on the 25th of January 1533. On 23rd of May 1533, Cranmer declared the marriage of Henry and Catherine null and void. 5 days later, Cranmer declared the marriage of Henry and Anne to be good and valid. Soon after, the Pope gave sentence of excommunication against the king and the archbishop. As a result of Anne's marriage to the king, the Church of England was forced to break with Rome and brought under the king's control. Anne was crowned Queen Consort of England on the 1st of June 1533, and, she gave birth to Henry's second daughter, Elizabeth, on the 7th of September. By 1536, she had suffered several miscarriages and had failed to give birth to a son. Henry grew tired of Anne and waiting for a son. He looked around for another mistress, while Thomas Cromwell, Anne's former ally, devised a plot to eliminate her. Despite unconvincing evidence, she was found guilty of engaging in sexual relations with her brother, George Boleyn, and other men, and Anne was beheaded on the 19th of May 1536 for adultery, incest, and high treason, after Henry had his marriage to her annulled just 2 days before. Jane Seymour was Henry's third wife. She served Catherine of Aragon as a maid of honour and was one of Anne Boleyn's ladies-in-waiting. Jane, the daughter of Sir John Seymour, a knight, and Marjorie Wentworth, was probably born at Wolf Hall, Wiltshire, although Westbower Manor in Somerset has also been suggested. She was of lower birth than most of Henry's wives, only being able to read and write a little, but was much better at needlework and household management, which were considered much more necessary for women at the time. In January 1536, the king took an interest in the demure and fair-haired Jane, the complete opposite of Queen Anne. When Anne was arrested for treason in May 1536, Jane was quickly moved into royal apartments. Jane married Henry on the 30th of May 1536 at the Palace of Whitehall in London, 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution. Jane was 28, and Henry was 44. As queen, Jane was known for her peaceful nature. She managed to repair the fraught relationship between Henry and his daughter Mary. Almost a year and a half after marriage, Jane gave birth to a male heir, Edward, but then died 12 days later from postpartum complications. Jane was the only wife to receive a royal burial. When Henry died, he chose to be buried next to her in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. It is unclear if this decision was purely sentimental or a political signal designed to reinforce the legitimacy of his youthful heir Edward, or perhaps both of those. Anne of Cleves was a German princess, Henry's fourth wife and Queen Consort of England, although not crowned, for just 6 months in 1540. Henry may have referred to her as a Flanders mare, and the label has stuck. In 1539, Henry VIII's chief minister Thomas Cromwell formed an alliance between England and Cleves, and Henry began considering Anne as his fourth wife. Anne of Cleves' portrait was painted by Hans Holbein the Younger and sent to King Henry to evaluate her. Her brother William did not allow Holbein to paint whilst looking directly at the face of Anne and her sister Amalia's, so they had to wear veils whilst being painted. Henry liked Anne's portrait and wanted her sent to him. When she arrived, Henry was not impressed. Henry complained that she didn't look like her portrait, almost like an early form of getting somebody off Tinder, isn't it, seeing they don't look like their photographs. Her pre-contract of marriage with Francis I of Lorraine was cited as grounds for annulment 6 months later. Anne did not resist the annulment, claiming the marriage had not been consummated, and was rewarded with a generous settlement, including Hever Castle, the former home of the Boleyns. She was given the title of the king's beloved sister, and was a lifelong friend to him and his children. Anne of Cleves was approximately the same age as Henry VIII's eldest surviving daughter Mary. She outlived the king and all his other wives, dying at Chelsea Old Manor on the 16th of July 1557. The most likely cause of her death was cancer. She was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of August. Catherine Howard was Henry's fifth wife between 1540 and 1542. She was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard and Joyce Culpeper, cousin to Anne Boleyn, second cousin to Jane Seymour, and niece to Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. She was raised in the household of a step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, Duchess of Norfolk. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was a prominent politician at Henry's court, and he secured her a place in the household of Henry's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, in 1540, where Catherine caught the king's interest. She married him on the 28th of July 1540 at Oatlands Palace in Surrey, just 19 days after the annulment of his marriage to Anne. He was 49, and she was still a teenager, probably around 17. On the 1st of November 1541, Henry was informed of her alleged adultery with Thomas Culpeper, a distant cousin. Henry Manox, who had given her private music lessons while she lived with her step-grandmother, and Frances Derham, the Duchess's secretary, with whom she had apparently had a sexual relationship. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen in November 1541 and was beheaded in 1542 in February on the grounds of treason for committing adultery. Catherine Parr was the sixth and last wife of Henry VIII. She was the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr of Kendal and his wife Maud Green. Through her father, Catherine was a descendant of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III. Through John of Gaunt's daughter, John Beaufort, Countess of Westmoreland, she was Henry's third cousin once removed. By Henry's paternal descent from another of John of Gaunt's children, John Beaufort, the two were also fourth cousins once removed. Catherine showed herself to be the restorer of Henry's court as a family home for his children. She was determined to present the royal household as a close-knit one to demonstrate strength through unity. Perhaps Catherine's most significant achievement was Henry's passing of a parliamentary act that confirmed both Mary and Elizabeth's place in the line of succession for the throne, despite the fact that they had both been made illegitimate by annulment. At the time of the passage of the act, Catherine Parr was 31, Mary was 27, Elizabeth was 10, and Henry was 52. Such was Henry's trust in Catherine that he chose her to rule as regent while he was attending to the war in France, and in the event of the loss of his life, she was to serve as regent until 9-year-old Edward came of age. Catherine also has a special place in history, as she was the most married queen of England, having had 4 husbands in all. Henry was her third. She'd been widowed twice before marrying Henry. After Henry's death, she married Thomas Seymour, uncle of Prince Edward, to whom she had formed an attachment before her marriage with Henry. She had one child by Seymour, Mary, but died shortly after childbirth, at age 35 or 36. Seymour was executed in 5049. Lady Mary's history is unknown, but she is not believed to have survived childhood. Those are the 6 wives of Henry VIII, giving you a little bit of information about their involvement with the king, and perhaps a little glimpse into aspects of their personality. But there's going to be more to come. Because what we're going to do is examine each of the 6 wives to make a determination as to what they were. Bearing in mind the man that they were married to and what he was suspected to be, what about them? Was it a succession of empaths that were ensnared by the supposed narcissist? Or were there a clash of narcissists? Maybe some normals came into the mix. We're going to look at the behaviours, personality, and characteristics of each of the 6 wives to make a determination, as per my usual classification, of is each one an empath, a narcissist, a normal, or narcissistic but not a narcissist. It'll be fascinating to look through at their behaviours and make this assessment. So, remain alert and keep your eyes peeled for these forthcoming videos.